Good morning. Hello. Thank you for joining us. My name's David Widmar. Today we're talking about the economics of agronomics, fungicide use in 2020. I'm really excited to be here today. I know this is a question that's on a lot of folks' minds as they're going through the 2020 growing season. And as an economist, I'm always thrilled whenever we can, do this cognitive island hopping and we can bring somebody into the conversation like Dr. Josh Miller to really help enhance the conversation. So I have a lot of thoughts about this topic. Josh has a lot of thoughts about this topic. We've spent a lot of time preparing to get you guys a presentation pulled together today. So Josh, thanks for joining us. Welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, like you said, my name is Josh Miller. I'm currently the technical market manager for plant health with BASF. So I get to really work with our fungicide products, bring them to market, understanding how they work. Really an exciting job. Before that, I worked retail for a good number of years on the East Coast. Believe it or not, we actually farm a little bit over there in Pennsylvania. And after I did that for a while, I decided to go back to school and learn more about what I was doing. So, a wide range of things there, but passion has really been around this idea of plant health and fungicides and protecting the plants from what Mother Nature's throwing at them.
Well, great. I know I've learned a lot from you as we prepared for this. So I look forward to today's conversation. Again, my name's David Widmar. I'm the co-founder of Ag Economic Insights. I'm an agricultural economist by training. I spend a lot of time thinking about the farm economy, what producers are thinking, the crop budget situation, but also how we go about making decisions. And we're going to talk about decision making, especially here at the end. We go want to think about that. So a little bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about today. We have 30 minutes planned. We've limited Josh and I to 30 minutes. We have 30 minutes worth of ideas to share, and then we're going to open it up to your Q&A. So after we hit that 30-minute mark, we're going to have a Jennifer Archer from BASF join us, and she's going to help moderate the questions. On your screen, there's a control panel that'll pop up if you move the mouse around. There's a little Q&A icon. If you click on that, you can type in your questions as we go through today's broadcast. You can submit them, and we're going to save all those questions for the end here, after the 30-minute mark, and we're going to get to all those questions. We're going to combine similar questions, but we're going to get to all the topics that get asked during this Q&A session. So we're going to talk about the growing season, some adjustments we might need to consider here in the growing season. We're going to talk about crop insurance. We're going to talk about, Josh has some great things to share with us about field level conditions that we need to think about. So we're talking about the economics of fungicide, and then we're going to talk about some agronomic considerations, and then we're going to your Q&As. So as an economist, been thinking a lot about the last few months. It's pretty rare. We always have a lot of commodity market activity this time of the year. It's pretty rare that Mother Nature or the markets act so quickly that it sort of destroys our crop budgeting plans in just a matter of weeks. And that was what we saw in February into March with the COVID situation. And we've seen big changes in the markets. This is a table that has a lot of moving parts in it. And you can, we're going to share a recording of this video afterwards, so you can really dive into this video if it's interest to you. But there's a couple moving parts here that I want to really draw your attention to. All the way to the right, this is the change in futures prices for corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton, and livestock since January and since about a year ago. Actually, I held this in April before we had that commodity market run up last year because of prevent plant. And as you can see across the board, we've seen some very significant decline. So 9% decline in soybean futures since January, 24% decline in cotton futures, thinking about what we might be marketing our crop for. And that's pretty unprecedented. That tears up our plans and our budget plans. And that leaves us to making decisions that we have to make here during the game. And how do we respond? We have our budgets in place, but now we're in the growing season. How do we shift gears in light of this bleaker economic outlook from the commodity markets? And I had an ag lender the other day tell me something that was really powerful. He said, David, we have to think about decisions with respect to timing. There are decisions we can make during the game. There are decisions we make between the games, and there's decisions we make between the seasons. And that's really important and really helpful to think about, especially as we go through what we're facing right now, this economic situation we're facing. What decisions can we make during the game, during this growing season? And we need to really focus on that. And when we go to make those decisions, we need to make sure that we have the best information and the best knowledge to make that. And so two of the things that I've been hearing a lot about as we were preparing for this webinar is, in light of these changes that producers are thinking about, they're saying, hey, does fungicide even pay at these price levels? And the second one is, well, what about the crop insurance implications? What about crop insurance? And so these are two really important considerations for us to think about, especially as we're going through the game time right now. So the goal here for Josh and I is going to help you improve the game time decision you're going to be making. And one of the tools that we have that's very intuitive, that we use a lot in the back of our mind, is a partial budget exercise. Now, ideally, we would have a time and capacity and management space to update our budgets anytime something new comes in, anytime we have a new expense or a new commodity price projection, but that actually takes a lot of effort, a lot of time in our efforts. And so how do we update our cost of production? How do we update our break evens when things are constantly changing? And oh, by the way, we're really busy with growing season activities. Well, farm management professionals and economists, we have this tool called the partial budget tool. And we use this a lot in the back of our mind. We can think about a decision that we have in front of us, like applying fungicide or second pass of herbicide, or maybe a rescue application of some additional fertilizer as we get through the rest of the growing season. We can look at this by sort of isolating all the variables specific to this decision, and we can extrapolate what that will do to our budget. So we think about changes in expected revenue, what's our additional revenue, and what's our changes in expected costs, our net benefit. And if this net benefit is positive, it closes the gap between our break even and the price that we're going to be receiving. Sort of our cost of production and the price that we're going to see. It's going to help us close that gap or give us a little extra profit. If it's negative, it's not something that we should be pursuing. So this is, again, a shortcut back of the envelope calculation that we can say, isolate the elements of one decision and understand how it's going to have an impact on our overall budget. Now, with respect to this partial budget, there's a couple disclaimers. We also need to think about how confident am I in my expectations? How good of information do I have about the changes in revenue or the changes in expected costs? And also, how significant is that net impact? Am I talking about a small net benefit on a big investment, or am I talking about a big return on a small investment? That's important to keep in mind. And actually, as we were thinking about this, there might be a scenario, we'll talk about this when we get to crop insurance, where even if the net benefit is zero, if it increases our yield and it can increase our APH over multiple years, that might still be a good strategy as you think about long-term implications. So the first element of this partial budget that you really have to know and really have to roll your sleeves up on are the changes in expected costs. And I went to the Purdue University, crop budgets, and I found that there was a line in the budgets, and all these crop budgets, I'm most familiar with the Purdue crop budgets, all these budgets have this line item in there, and it's sort of $28 to $32 per acre, and it says applied. And the real question that jumps out at us, well, what does that mean? So if you think about a group of farmers at a coffee shop, and one of them asks, how much does it cost to put on fungicide? They're going to get a lot of different numbers. And the reason why is because there's product costs and there's application costs. And on the product cost, this is the actual fungicide that we're going to put in the tank. And there's also the application costs. And so for the product cost, it obviously depends on the fungicide you're using, the crop that you're approaching. In a lot of cases, it gets into this $10 to $28 per acre. Josh, as we were preparing for this, you shared that cotton fungicide can sometimes be even on a little bit higher than this, approaching maybe somewhere to $30 per acre. And on the application costs, on the high end, you have to actually hire a custom applicator to fly on the product. And Josh really pushed back at me on this when I put an application cost of zero, but it led to a good conversation. What is a zero application cost? Well, when I talk with a lot of producers, in some cases, they're saying, hey, I'm comfortable using my own rig my own ground rig to apply this fungicide cost. I already have the labor. I'm already paying for the machine out of the rest of my fixed expenses. And the only thing I'm really out here is the water and the labor. And so my additional cash flow is nearly zero. And so it's really important to recognize that when we think about the cost of applying an acre of fungicide, you're going to hear a lot of different answers from a lot of different folks. And so you have to start by creating your own plan for your own operation. Put a stake in the ground and go talk to a trusted advisor and say, hey, what product should I be putting on this field, on this acre? And then think about that application cost. What's specific to you? Use your own cost. And then you can start thinking about, okay, what if I use this different product? What if I use this different application method? But start with a stake in the ground. It can be kind of overwhelming to go to that coffee shop and have that conversation and hear a bunch of different people's opinions, as they all have different costs and they have different ideas about what's included in that cost structure. All right, changes in expected revenue. This is, again, another element that has a lot of moving pieces. We have a change in yield. So what's the yield increase that we might be getting? But also, what's that change in expected price? And it's the change in, it's that expected price, that thing that we multiply the change in yield by. That's where a lot of folks are scratching their head here in 2020 saying, hey, is it worth, do the economics pay out here for me to make this additional application? Because when we have lower prices, this is what really makes this benefit cost analysis or this net impact positive. And so you're going to want to work with that trusted agronomic advisor and have a good conversation about what can I reasonably expect to occur here in 2020 with respect to a yield response. And then you need to go back to look at your budget. You need to update your budget and say, hey, what is the price that I can expect to receive for this crop? A couple things I want to point out here. One, it's easy to get off course and not compare apples to apples. So we might walk into the retailer and say, hey, what would be the yield response to if I apply this fungicide? And they give you an idea in a price. And they say, okay, here's another alternative. It's a lower price product. And all of a sudden we start to compound all the moving pieces. And so you don't want to confuse a $10 solutions with the benefits of a $20 solution. So $10 solutions don't buy the benefits of a $20 solution. And we really have to keep that in mind. Fungicides are not a commodity. And so they're different products and they have different responses. And we got to be very careful about that, how we plug that in. And that also gets us to the next point, which is where Josh is going to come in and really help us think about this. The difference between how I might expect a product to respond on average, year in and year out over multiple years, versus what's going to happen here in 2020.
Yeah, I think this is where my head is a lot of the times, especially with my role right now, and even when I was in retail before, because fungicides, for some reason, I feel like this indication, more than any other, is seen as all fungicides are fungicides. When we get into herbicides, we know the modes of action we're using, the combination of modes of action, the weed spectrum we're trying to hit with those, resistance management that we're trying to really tackle with that. But when it comes to fungicides, for some reason, it seems like we revert back. And so we may choose to use a fungicide, we get sold on a benefit, but then, like you just said, now we'll start to work backwards and say, well, I like the idea of a benefit now. Let me see which lower cost option there potentially is. And we see that kind of in the market right now too. If you can flip to the next one. This number was kind of staggering to me when we started looking at fungicide usage in the US. And from 2005 to present, around 90% of farmers have used a fungicide on their operations. But today that number only stands at 40%. Okay, so that means 50% of farmers out there have tried a fungicide, but today are saying that no, it doesn't pay, or they didn't see this expected revenue, or at least perceived revenue they were getting from that. And so why did that happen? Was it because of a promise of a $20 solution but used the $10 option and didn't quite realize it? Or do we have maybe not appropriate expectations set because of this on average versus reality? And so that's what I want to get into next here, because that's one of the things that we really saw as a challenge at BASF was, and we're guilty of it just as much as everybody else is, but how often do we find ourselves looking at data charts, these bar charts from single locations across the country that show the performance of a fungicide? And you might be down in Arkansas and this chart comes from Iowa, and you're supposed to take that as what the average benefit's going to be on your operation. And so what we did differently last year to really get at this was do the RevX Fields initiative. And so what we saw, if you can click through that, we placed over 1,200 on-farm trials. We flew NDVI drone imagery, we collected yields, had a third party validate it, and then we made all those results available publicly on revxfields.com. We really wanted to drive around the confidence. David just went through, I didn't know the term partial budgeting, but that's what we thought about all the time when I was working in retail. The confidence that we can have in our decision based on the reality of our situation. And so when you can see the yields and the responses that we have in your backyard or your neighbor's backyard, in your environments, your disease pressure, that's going to help us have more confidence that the decisions we're making are actually going to give us the expected revenue, which is going to give us the expected net benefit that if fungicide be positive.
Yeah, it's really important that we think about what, there's a lot of folks that can help us think about that, but it's really important that we think about what are the benefits that I'm going to see, and we apply that to our operation. We compare our benefits and our expected benefits to our unique specific costs. So Josh, the other one that we heard about when we were preparing for this and thinking about this was crop insurance. And in light of the commodity market retreat, there's an idea out there, and it makes a lot of sense on the surface level that, hey, I'm at a point where I'm getting really close to collecting crop insurance. And so if I actually made the investment and maybe applied fungicide or I did an additional fertilizer pass here during the growing season, the only benefit that I'm going to get is just going to eat away at any sort of crop insurance revenue. So I'm at the point where my revenue has fallen below the threshold for crop insurance. So any gains is just going to be offsetting. So my net in my pocket doesn't particularly change. And that's a really important factor to consider. And as I was pulling this idea and thinking about it, I went and did the math. And so here's an example of a crop insurance situation where the APH is 50 bushels per acre, our spring price is 917, and let's assume a coverage level right now at 80%. Well, that gets us about $370 in insurance coverage. And the idea here is I'm already below my coverage level. Any sort of rescue management or management plan that I might be doing now is going to make an improvement in my revenue that I sell, the crop I sell, but it's going to keep me under this coverage level. I said, okay, let's test this idea. How likely is that to be the case? So across the top here, I have a few different yield outcomes from 50 bushels down to 35. I also looked at some commodity price expectations for that fall price. And right now we're at 870 or so for the futures price for that crop insurance window. And the takeaway I saw here, it's all the values in that matrix C tell us what our potential crop insurance payments are. So if we have a 45 bushel yield at $8 on the price, we're going to see a $6.80 crop insurance premium. If that falls to $7.75, we'd get an $18 crop insurance premium. So when I looked at this, as an economist, I was looking at this, we're not as close to those crop insurance thresholds as I think everyone initially thought. That back of the envelope of that mental math we were doing, we're just not really there on that crop insurance threshold as we might think about. The other thing I'll point out is this is an 80% coverage scenario. I also ran it at a 70%. 80% is pretty high. So if you had a 70% crop insurance threshold, as you can see, that table shifts up and to the left. It's going to take a lot more of a yield hit to really see those crop insurance revenue proceeds start to come in mind. So again, it's a very viable management plan to look at this and say, hey, I'm in a very disaster scenario. I'm in a crop insurance threshold. I need to manage this crop accordingly. But my point to sharing this is that we really have to think critically about that assumption, and we really have to look at our farm situation. So keep in mind that the pricing window for that fall crop insurance price is in October for corn and soybeans. Right now here in June, we're well into the growing season here in the South. Yields are starting to come into focus, but there's still a lot of uncertainty. Keep in mind also the price that we sell the crop for is different than the crop insurance price. And that can be really important if we think about how long our marketing window is. And so the crop insurance window is in October. We still have the winter and early spring maybe to market that crop. So we got to think about that as well. And finally, the long-term APH implications. There could still be an argument here that even if my net benefit for my partial budget is zero or very small, if I know that fungicides year in and year out give me a yield bump, it might still be a great tool to use to help bump my APH, which gives me a higher coverage level in the future. On the other hand, if you're worried that, hey, I already have, I'm sort of on the bubble here, in the break even might not pay out. Well, if we can get a little extra yield here, it can also, here in 2020, it can also potentially avoid a bad year in our APH. So there's a long-term strategy using fungicides over multiple years to bump our APH, but there's also a strategy here in a single year. You want to avoid those bad years that really weigh down our APH in the future. So the takeaway from this is, I think a lot of producers are not at this point where they can throw their hands up and say, I'm in the crop insurance zone. I'm in sort of a full retreat here, and I need to really manage this crop differently. We still have some pretty positive yield potentials here. I think the threshold for getting a crop insurance payout is a lot lower than what we'd like to think about. So we still have to manage this crop. Again, keep in mind my matrix here is from the APH and lower. There's still a lot of possibility to have above average crops here, and we got to manage that crop accordingly. So Josh, I'm going to turn it over to you and really help us put boots in the ground and think about some agronomic factors that we also have to consider for fungicide, and also the rest of the growing season for other elements we got to consider.
Yeah, try to tailor this to the geography that we're talking about right now. And so I'm in North Carolina, so I'm not down in Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas right now. So I had to reach out to kind of get a feel for what's happening currently this season. But one of the first things that popped up was, if you can advance the slide for me, please, the planting and yield potential. I think we always want to kind of see what is our yield potential going into the season. This is a conversation we kind of have set. Last season it was a whole different story with the delayed planting, a lot of prevent plant acres out there, things like that. This year, whether we're talking about corn, except for North Dakota for some reason, or soybeans or even cotton, we're looking pretty good with planting. Things are getting in the ground at the right time. Some places have had a little slower spring, a little cooler spring, not necessarily down in the south too much, but we've got this potential right now for everything that we know ahead of us, that we've got high yield potential. And so we want to make sure that we could continue to do what we can with that. The next consideration is, especially in the south, thinking about those canopy microclimates. This is important when we think about fungicides. We think about diseases from, in most of the country, about what is the environment going to be like this season. Is it going to be hot and humid to really drive that condition that's going to favor disease pressure and prevalence? But oftentimes in the South, we're creating that regardless of what the outside climate is. If we have heat outside, we're creating that humid condition in the canopy with these microclimates that we have with like furrow irrigation, things like that. And so oftentimes the stage is already set for higher potential disease pressure because of what we're doing here and the potential risks. The third one is, what is the environmental stress component? We know, and anybody that's heard BASF talk, we talk about environmental stress a lot because of the way that our products can help alleviate and help mitigate some of those stresses. And I was talking to somebody down in Arkansas, and apparently you guys are projected to have one of the hottest summers on record here. And so we're going to have potentially this situation this summer where we have a lot of this stress coming from the environment. And so being able to protect the yield potential we've got going into it is going to be a benefit. And finally, disease control. I had another picture in here at first where I was going to talk about target spot and some of the other issues you guys face down there. But this tweet just got sent to me this morning. It was yesterday. Bob Kemwright, extension pathologist in Georgia, started talking about how he just saw first confirmed southern rust down there in Florida. And then a response to that was, if you can put that up, the response to that was Trey Price over there in Louisiana, and both these guys are talking about how early this is for that disease. And so now we have a situation where we have high yield potential, the microclimates that we already create artificially with the furrow irrigation, environmental stress looking like it's probably going to be potentially pretty high for us this year, and now disease pressure rolling in earlier than expected. This is I would argue a critical time to be thinking about fungicides for the standpoint of what that expected revenue is going to be from this type of application.
Yeah, it's very very timely. We always got to think about, we want to make sure we don't get into a situation where we back ourselves into a corner. So I grew up in southeast Kansas, and we try to raise wheat down there, but there's a lot of water, a lot of rainfall in that part of the state. And I always remember the only time that you know for sure that you should apply fungicide is when you can see it in the wheat. You can see the fungus in the wheat crop, right? When you can walk out in the wheat field and see that you have a problem, it's too late to do something about it. And so we always have to think about this planning horizon and make sure that we have enough time to make that decision. So to wrap up today, before we get to the Q&A, I wanted to share one of my favorite graphs. This looks at the total production expenses for raising corn and soybeans in the Midwest. And you can apply this to anywhere in the country. The story is almost the same. And look at the blue quarter there, the blue pie slice. It's fertilizer, seed, and pesticides, 26% of total production expenses. And if you think about it, economists spend a lot of time focused on that slice of the pie. Producers spend a lot of time making sure that we get the lowest price for our inputs. Ag media spends a lot of time writing about getting our fertilizer, seed, and pesticide prices in check. And if you add the next bucket, it's the red one, it's our variable cost of production. So we get to 40%. 40% are our variable cost of production. And I share this because we have to understand the 60-40 rule, right? We have to understand how our cost structure is on our farm. And for a lot of cases, about 40% of our costs are variable, while 60% of those are fixed. Now, how much time do we spend focused on those variable costs of production and managing those variable costs of production? We spend a disproportionate amount of our time. Great managers know that we got to focus on the whole pie, and we got to go after all the slices of the pie. And in a lot of cases, there might not be that much variability between our fertilizer or our seed or our pesticide or our fungicide expense relative to our neighbor, but there could be a very big differential between what we spend on machinery, land, and family labor and what our neighbors do. And so these are also the hard buckets to tackle, but in light of a tough economic situation, we have to really focus on the entire pie chart. And I think this is a message that is going to be important to keep in mind for the next 6 to 8 months. We're going to have to really tackle all slices of that pie chart. And one more thing before Josh shares his thoughts. Keep in mind that a lot of those variable costs are directly linked to our yield performance. And the quickest way to raise our cost per bushel is to stub our toe and not apply enough fertilizer or not get the right fungicide program in place and have a yield hit. So whenever we have total cost per acre and we divide that by yield, that's how we get our cost per bushel. And we sell bushels. That's important to keep in mind. The quickest way to raise our cost per bushel is to limit our yield growth. Now, sometimes weather comes into effect. Sometimes we can't avoid a yield hit, but we don't want to have management limitations on our yield performance. So Josh, you're going to finish this up here. You're going to share your final thoughts as we head into, we wrap this session up and head into Q&A.
Yeah, so this was a fun exercise to work with you, David, because it got me thinking about fungicides in a different way. And we started talking about probabilities and all this kind of stuff, and man, it was stretched my brain a little bit. But when we got to think about it, I was drawn to an example that just happened to me recently about the decision that goes into making a fungicide application. And I don't know who's familiar with the company Peloton, but they make these really expensive indoor exercising bikes. And so I thought I was going to try my hand at day trading. And so if you can go to the chart there, I looked at this chart and I decided right after January 1st, January 3rd, I decided to buy some stock in Peloton because I was like, you know what? Everybody's coming off a holiday break. They're going to want to shed some pounds. This is going to be the place where they put some money and invest in some things. And so I held on to that for a little bit with that idea. And then after a few months there, I realized that this wasn't panning out or this wasn't going the way I thought it would. And so I sold it with just a small loss. But what I couldn't foresee was that in March, this little thing called coronavirus was going to hit, and then all gyms will be shut down, and our entire lives will be turned upside down. And then what happened to this Peloton stock after that was just this rapid increase in continued growth, a 248% increase from that low. And so I think that this kind of relates to what the fungicide buying decision feels like sometimes. We're in the beginning of the season. We think that it might be a good idea, it might be a good plan, but now the commodity prices are starting to go down a little bit. I'm not sure if it's going to be there, and so I'm trying to foresee what the future is going to hold, that it's not going to be a benefit. So I'm kind of day trading this aspect, and so we may back out that decision. But what's going to happen the rest of the time? That COVID situation may be that early southern rust run on our crops that we didn't foresee, or that stress that happens in the summertime. And so the increase isn't necessarily going to be an increase in yield. What we're going to see is an increase in net benefit because of these factors that are going to happen that we can't foresee. So we're basically trying to predict the market about what's going to happen in the field and whether we think we're going to get benefit or not. And so what I think is more beneficial, if we can go to the next slide, is thinking about what are the unknowns. We talked about yield potential, that we are looking at probably high yield potential right now. We don't necessarily know what the disease pressure is going to be throughout the rest of the season. And another really critical point to this is the fact that diseases are often, by the time we see them, the damage is often done to some degree. There's what we call the latency period, where there's an infection, but we don't see it happening for a significant amount of time. And so, if we go back the previous situation where when we're talking about day trading, by the time we saw COVID really taking effect, we were already kind of on that upward slope. And so if you jumped in, we think we can see it happening, but we're often too late anyway. And the growing season is going to have a lot to do with that as well. So think about the benefits that are out there when we talk about fungicide. Obviously, we talk about yield benefits, but there's also non-yield benefits. The APH impact that David talked about, standability and harvest efficiency, keeping that plant healthy through the end of the season. There's a lot that can happen and a lot of consistent performance we see when we use a fungicide. If we look at our two new ones, I just want to throw a few numbers out there because we did all these on-farm trials. So what did that look like this past season? When we looked at our corn, this is probably one of those years where we wouldn't have expected a huge response to fungicides, especially where we were targeted. We had, if you remember last year, very delayed planting, prevent plant acres were all over the place. Fungicides we're trying to get them out on time, but a lot of things were delayed and disease pressure wasn't necessarily high. So there was a lot of those situations where we would have said this may not be the best time to put a fungicide out, but because we were doing the Rebex trials, we put those out. And what we saw in just the ones that were against untreated was 11 bushels with corn. 93% of the time we had positive response. When we look at the Rebitech, 94% of the time we had a positive yield advantage, and it was a 6 bushel advantage across those. And so instead of thinking about this day trading way to approach fungicides and thinking about all the unknowns that we don't know but we think that we can predict, I think it makes more sense to take maybe the 401k approach and think about the mutual fund that year in, year out, even in corn last year where it wouldn't have been a year that we really see the benefits that we would have thought, we still had that 11 bushel response, 93% positive response there. And so this is something we should consider over the long term as a positive and a good decision to continue to make sure that we're profitable and sustainable on the farm.
Yeah, that's a really great way to wrap this up as we think about how do we approach as a producer, how do we approach the fungicide question on our farm? Is it a strategy that we play year in and year out, or is it something that we're trying to jump in and jump out and try to outsmart the market? And I know, like the Peloton, a good stock, we should buy it and we should hold on to it. And so I think it's helpful to think about that fungicide decisions when we see products that work year in and year out. How do we move those into our long-term strategic plans and make sure we don't have to worry about missing in those years where we aren't able to outsmart the market and the market moves against us. So that wraps up our 30-minute presentation. Thank you for your time and thank you for the questions. We've seen quite a few questions coming through. And so I'm going to invite Jennifer Archer from BASF to help sort through those and throw them our way. Again, we're going to share the PowerPoint, we're going to share the recording of this video later with you, either at the end of this week or first part of next week. So Jennifer, thank you for agreeing to help us out. What are you seeing from the Q&A?
So many of the questions really actually stem towards what should we expect in a return from a fungicide? So I take that, I hear this question a lot. Should I break even? Is it a 2-to-1 payback or 3-to-1 payback? Should I just see it? So what are some of the expectations that we should be able to see in a return from a fungicide?
So I'm going to set this up at the high level, and then I'm going to kick it over to Josh and let him get into the, I think what we should be thinking about is there's different types of years, right? There are years that have low disease pressure, and there's years with high disease pressure. And you can break that up in a lot of different categories, right? But the ideal solution would be a product that gives you a positive return in those low pressure years. So maybe that's 5 or 6 years out of 10, but they also perform and provide you positive benefits in those high pressure years. If you really started digging into these, and Josh and I got into some of this data, and I think that some of this data is available to you on that revextrials.com website. Some products perform well in the low disease pressure years. Some products perform well in the high disease pressure years. But how do we find a product that, like that stock example, how do we find a workhorse that works well year in and year out? So Josh, I'll let you dive into the specifics a little bit there.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Like David just said, this has led me kind of think about looking at our data in different ways. We always just talk about the yield benefits and just averages and things like that. And so we started doing some exercises where we started looking at the probabilities of different scenarios. And one of the things that became clear was that there was a positive benefit regardless of the scenario. Especially, I was taking Revitech, for example, whereas the net revenue, when you consider costs and things like that, were less in low disease environments. We were still looking on the order of, that 1.5 to 1 return type deal, where you're seeing maybe a $12 return, something like that. But when it really started to make those massive returns was when we started moving south, when you had those higher disease pressure areas, where you had those higher instances of environmental stresses. And that's where the yield started jumping off the roof, and that's where those net revenues started jumping off as well. So we can take it on average, but we also need to dig into the probability of the scenario that you're going to have, like David mentioned. The other thing that he was bringing up there, or alluding to, was we started really comparing this to some other products out there. And it was kind of interesting from the standpoint of, we started asking those questions. What is it, when we started looking at the $10 solutions, trying to get $20 solution type benefits. And we started looking at other maybe what we would call higher tier fungicides, and how do we stack up, and then how do we look at maybe lower cost options and how do we stack up. And interestingly, we saw kind of consistency with the Revitech that we were looking at, higher obviously in high disease pressures, and it went down a little bit in low. But when we looked at some of the other higher tier products, they had pretty good returns in high disease pressure environment, but then really fell off and potentially had negative returns when there was low disease environment. It was like very specific where that would win. And when we looked at the lower cost options, that flipped completely. When there was high disease pressure, there was no net return because they weren't providing the level of benefit from the disease control. And when it was a low disease environment or no pressure, it was maybe a small positive net benefit because the low cost option allowed it, and there wasn't that much pressure, allowed it to be a potential there. And so it's almost like you could try with another high, premium product, high tier product, and guess that you're going to have high disease, but if there's no disease, you're missing the boat. You could guess over here and say you're going to have low disease, but if you have high disease, that low cost option was going to fall flat as well. Whereas the Revitech and the Veltima had that consistency regardless of those scenarios. So I know that was a long-winded answer, but this was some work that Dave and I started digging into, and I'm glad I got the opportunity to talk about it because we had no idea how to work this into the conversation.
Thanks, Josh. The next question was, what diseases should we be most worried about in 2020?
Yeah, so specifically to this geography, I think I obviously showed in corn there the southern rust. Now that's already starting to pop up. It was identified first in Texas a few weeks ago in one county, and now it's been in Louisiana and Florida. And so that one is a windborne product. So the spores have to blow in. It comes in new every year from Mexico and up into the Gulf. So we're already started, so we need to continue to track that one. Make sure we're ahead of that one. It's hard to catch up on that when it's behind. The other ones, if we have this really hot condition this year, and when we have those humid environments that we're creating in our soybeans with the furrow irrigation, I think target spot is certainly something that we need to keep our eyes out for. This is another one where we do not want to get behind this one. this disease is a severe defoliator, and you oftentimes won't even notice it until it's too late because it starts low in the canopy and works its way up. And so be out there scouting for that one, especially in fields where you've had a history or counties where there's been a history of this before. And then obviously the last one is frog eye leaf spot. It's kind of just that perennial that we're always looking out for.
All right, and last one. This one might be more for David. What if I run out of cash to make an application?
Yeah, that's a challenge that we have to think about here in any year, but especially 2020. So the first thing I keep in mind is usually a lot of options here for financing that might extend beyond your traditional line of credit or your traditional financing. And so I don't know the specifics of this detail, but I would encourage you to look for maybe manufacturer or retailer based financing. There actually seems to be a lot of financing available. And that's one of the positives, I think, that you can think about from the big disease on everyone's mind is the COVID virus. We haven't seen the financial markets freeze up, and that's a really positive development. And so the other thing that I would recommend here is we don't want to, market, it's always not fun to market grain in the middle of the year when prices aren't as where we like them to be. But if you do the homework and you do the pencil, and you can go into a lender or you can go into a finance provider and you can say, hey, this is what it looks like on my break even. And oh, by the way, I'm going to go market these bushels to cover that cost right now. That really helps. That makes a lot of management sense to actually offset that additional purchase or that additional expense with actually marketing some grain, because we don't know what the next year might have in store.
All right, thank you.
All right, well, go ahead, Jennifer.
Sorry. That looks like all the questions we have.
All right, well, thank you all again for joining us. You can feel free to reach out to us if you have any additional questions. Otherwise, look for an email from me with the recording of this. Thank you all for joining us. Best of luck in 2020, and we hope to see you again in the future. Thanks so much.
Thank you.